Yes, I would like to focus this presentation on the role of discourse in society, which is both liberating and enslaving. And I will particularly focus on how a universal basic income, implemented at the core of a broader vision, of a broader story of society, can initiate and accompany a deeper, radical, and fundamental change in discourse. Therefore, in our culture, in our understanding of the self, in the meaning and modes of social interaction, in our relationship to other species, and ultimately to the planet on which we are hosts, as Heidegger said. So this is a story that the very broad defined left has not been able to articulate so far. And we must remind ourselves that even in the glory days, the golden years of the left between the late 1940s and the beginning of the 1970s, well, these years were not so much more than a compromise between profit-driven and exploitative forces of capitalism and the let's stave off the worst effect of social democracy. So this story, which needs to be credible, convincing, comprehensible, and comprehensive, this vision of the new possible is long overdue. And regardless of the multiple threats and crises that we've been living through, and we are living through, regardless of the suffering, which is recorded both in material inequality rates and in epidemics and pandemics of mental illnesses, regardless of the widespread acknowledgement and acceptance of the limits of the planet's resources, we seem unable as a species, so at a global level, to redefine what is possible. And we are stuck in fear, we are stuck in anxiety, and in the paralysis that all of this produces. And we cannot see hope because the realization of this hope actually requires fundamental changes, which are at the value level and at the meaning level. So what is the role of discourse in this inescapable trap, and what is the role of a universal basic income? So let us start from an overview of what I mean by discourse, or better, the discourses that have governed our contemporary era. So a discourse, which is also known as a paradigm in Kuhn philosophy, or an episteme in Foucault language, can be thought of as an organizing principle of society. It's organizing because it confers meanings to everything, to the self, to the society. It establishes roles, defines values, and therefore it directly affects and shapes what we think, what we do, and how we do it. In other words, it pierces through the material reality with real effects in the real world. So, for example, the neoliberal discourse, which has articulated a specific view of human nature, so the self-interested, the competitive, selfish, and above all, rational, calculative being, has a certain number of values attached, which are functional to the very existence of this mythical being. And these are, well, the value of efficiency, of productivity, materialism, individualism, speed, etc. So this very construction of human and of human need is necessary for this system, for the neoliberal, now rentier form of capitalism to function. So we have to compete, we have to produce, we have to compare, to strive, to grow, as an end in itself, to grow. And this discourse, which was skillfully articulated in a broader frame, in a broader story by the Montpellierin society from the late 1940s, has become so hegemonic to be invisible. It's our common sense. On top of that, neoliberalism united in a marriage of mutual advantages and compromises with neoconservatism and got sedimented during the Thatcher and Reagan years. From neoconservatism genome, we have inherited a number of things. So a deeply seated patriarchal structure of our society. We have inherited the work ethic, the male white breadwinner model that has colonized the care ethic of our caretaking species, to the point where caregivers, which are still predominantly women, are forced to adapt, to strive, and to compete in a very cutthroat model in education and in the labor markets. We have inherited concepts such as the deserving and the undeserving poor, the dull bludger, that not only transforms the weakest in our societies into supplicants because they are deprived of voice. It shapes their perception of the self by suppressing their self-worth and their inner human value, therefore their capacity to self-determine their future. And of course, on the opposite hand, has allowed the wealthiest in our society to persuade themselves and ourselves that they merit all the wealth that they've accumulated. The end story of this marriage is well known, and we are in fact living through it. It's a world on the brink of collapse. So what does have a UBI, a universal basic income, do with all this? Isn't UBI just some conspiracy from Silicon Valley, or some hardcore socialist dream of authoritarianism, or some decrepit communist last hope? Well, I think that these are understandable questions, and there is an understandable fear that underlies these questions, which is given by our common past and present. However, there is also a lack of hope in this question, and it's a lack of hope that worries me. It's a shortage of what Mills called the sociological imagination, and it's a form of resignation, really, to accept that humans might truly be what modern discourses have made us to believe. I would instead argue that a universal basic income, understood in its broader sense, so firstly, it's universal, which means that every citizen, regardless of age, is entitled to it, and it's not means-tested. Unconditional, in the sense of being obligation-free. There is no willingness to work test, and it's paid on the individual, not household basis. It's basic, so we can think of it as a floor on which everyone can stand and build their lives in whatever way they want, so that there could also be a top-up from other incomes, and one that needs to be high enough to offer a real exit option from labor markets and market logics. And also importantly, talking to the broader left, one that does not substitute for the public funding of quality education, healthcare, and additional services that might be required. And ultimately, it's an income, so it's paid in cash. It's not any paternalistic measure of provision of goods and services, and it's not based on a charity principle, which underpins the current welfare states. It's based on a right principle. And it's in this rightful share of the commons. It's the rightful share of the knowledge of the social wealth that we have inherited as a species that we find one of the three philosophical bases on which UBI stands. And the other two bases are philosophical bases are libertarian conception of freedom, which is the freedom to choose and the freedom to say no, and the Republican conception of freedom from domination. So this universal basic income can become the core policy of a fundamental discursive shift that will enable the cultural, social, psychological, socio-political, and economic shift towards a society built on the values that were listed at the beginning. So it's interdependence, equality, universalism, social and ecological justice. So how can we do it? Well, universal basic income needs to be framed with other circulating progressive discourses and articulated with their deeper values. These discourses already exist, and a universal basic income articulates their values in the following ways. Firstly, it embodies a refusal to measure social value and personal dignity of human beings based on their participation in the production and in the consumption process, which rings true for the broader post-productivist discourse. Secondly, it reevaluates care for each other, care for nature, care for for ourselves, and all the activities that are delinked from profit making. In other words, it allows for the mutual recognition of autonomy as human beings, and it fosters trust, which is so much needed in our society. It is paid at the individual, not household basis. Therefore, it could address an equal and gender-based power relationship within the household. And this is obviously shared by various strands of feminist discourse. It democratizes the politics of time towards more time-rich and less consumption-oriented lifestyles, so that it can undermine the commodification of everyday life and facilitates a sustainable transition within ecological limits, as ecologists, environmentalist discourses would demand. Its universal character means that it might strengthen social solidarity and social cohesion because it's universal. Everyone is treated equally. It might reignite the value and significance of the common good, which we seem to have lost a while ago, and allow time, resources, and the mental capacity that we need to be engaged politically, to be engaged in the decisions of this common good, as communitarians and radical democratic discourses advocate for. It embodies the original passion of socialist discourse in that it radically recasts the power relationship between labor and capital, because it links a duty to work from a right to income. And by doing so, it does not deny that paid labor gives some form of dignity. It does not deny that paid labor functionally structures time. What it does is that it broadens what we as a society define and recognize as valuable work, and enables the possibility to say no to jobs that have no intrinsic psychological and social value. It removes domination from state bureaucracy, from employers, from husbands, from market logic. It allows for self-determination and for risk-taking, which is so much demanded by left libertarians. And it also removes state paternalism, which is demanded by right libertarians. Ultimately, it frees up all the human creative forces to redesign technologies, their use, and the distribution of their benefits, which is very unequal and impacting society in very different ways. So universal basic income, a policy that could simply be considered an instrument to radical redistribution, could in fact initiate a paradigmatic shift. And if it is all now in the hands of us, certainly as citizens, but also of the broadly defined progressive left, to maturely deliberate, addressing their differences, the internal differences, not suppressing them, and to articulate the similar values and political demands in a much needed vision. A corollary of other policies will be needed, absolutely, to guide society in the direction that this vision demands. And in this, a universal basic income can be a first and not a last step. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leonora. That was amazing. It really is a universalizing concept, and it is something which you foregrounded so clearly there, that the current discourses that we have been living under for so long are actually really not beneficial to the species, and multiple species that are on this planet. And it is time for something like this to really kick in. Stop and stop, 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 wake in, wake out, it's chock-a-block.